Sphinx, Secrets of History. Mid-16th century, southern France. An old man gazes at the stars. He's a prophet, and he foresees the future, so they say. A future that brings death and ruin. A comet will fall from the sky, the fortune teller predicts. A celestial body made of stone and ice. He will fall upon the earth and wipe out all life. An inferno, a nightmare. A firestorm that leaves nothing behind but death and cold. The vision of the end of the earth. No one else has predicted the fate of the world as bleakly as the prophet from southern France, and hardly any other predictor of the future was believed as much as he is to this day. His name, Nostradamus. Nostradamus. Prophet of Doom. His life and work are still controversial today. Genius or profiteer? Prophet or charlatan? Who was Nostradamus? He wrote almost 1,000 verses about the future. More than 400 years ago, he's said to have foreseen Hitler's terror, the French Revolution, Napoleon, and finally the end of the world. This little book, The Prophecies, became a huge hit during his lifetime, but no one has been able to interpret these verses. They have remained pawns of the imagination, like that verse that mentions the year 1999. A great terror king will then come down from heaven. Comet impact, nuclear war, or natural disaster. What might Nostradamus have meant? Nostradamus, the prophet of the apocalypse, of doom. But his feet are not clear. He had to veil reality, so as not to hand it over to the enemies of the truth. As he writes himself, fear of the Inquisition, and so to this day. Nostradamus connoisseurs around the world search for the true key of the prophecies. Meanwhile, also with the most modern technology, the decryption expert Manfred Dimmt saved all 4,000 sentences of the prophecies in his computer. He's convinced that secret messages are encoded in these texts. They can be made visible again with the computer. As in Century 10 verse 100, Le Grand Empire sera par Angleterre, it says, the great empire will be through England. The computer program first deletes all spaces between the words. The result, a string of letters, which is then subdivided again. From a repository containing thousands of old French words. The vocabulary store sets new, completely different grades. The sentence changes. Now it is said that the great millennium will bring a bad era to England. Words behind words, a game of hide and seek. Manfred Dimmt believes that Nostradamus had to cloak his knowledge to avoid censorship by the church. Through systematic text analysis, you can see how people worked in the Middle Ages, and you can see very clearly that whole sentences suddenly become visible that were not before. that were practically
and
invisible
with the possibilities that the computer and word processing offer us today, we can now analyze and visualize things in minutes, in seconds, that we couldn't visualize 20 or 30 years ago. The town of Saint-Rémy in southern France. In this house stood the cradle of the mysterious prophet. The plaque mentions his birthday, December 14, 1503. Crumbling walls, blind windows, nothing is reminiscent of the former prosperity. Today, junk is stored here, a storeroom of history. Everything must have been magnificent here in the past, back when both of Nostradamus' grandfathers were advisors to the Count of Provence, Jewish intellectuals, respected and wealthy. The young Nostradamus grows up in this mysterious world, which forms the transition between the Middle Ages and modern times, in which a royal advisor is both a doctor and an alchemist, and an astrologer and a magician, in which old superstition and new science mix, in which one curiously searches for the secret of life, for the philosopher's stone, for immortality. What he sees in his grandfather's house will occupy him for the rest of his life. They call him the little astrologer early on. He asks the adult questions, the dangerous questions. A loner, a visionary, even as a child. One who reads the future from the nature that surrounds him. But so much about Nostradamus is legend, conjecture, myth. Only very few genuine historical testimonies have been preserved, such as this painted copper plate. Because of it, we know his face. Nostradamus portrayed by his son Caesar. His contemporaries describe him as dignified and serious, and yet a rebel shows his life. He is listed in the student book of the medical faculty in Montpellier, but at some point the dean crossed out his name again. The scrawled accusation reads that he pursued methods that were too idiosyncratic. The medical faculty of Montpellier is the most advanced of its time. In these rooms, the students are not only instructed in the teachings of antiquity, you can also explore new things here, on dead bodies. Montpellier is the only university in France that has the right to open a corpse every year. Only that of a killed heretic, though. Anatomical studies on cadavers. That's the medical sensation of the time. This is the progress of a new era. And contemporary books report on it in amazement, in words and in pictures. But even Montpellier, the most advanced of the cities, is not spared from a huge catastrophe. 1525, disaster strikes. The plague is in town. Nostradamus, who is by no means a complete doctor, experiences the horror at close range. Men disfigured, women in tears, children wild, the elderly petrified. This is how he describes the misery. He helps where he can, but his methods are unconventional. He avoids the usual odolous instead prescribing cleansing baths. Nobody understands why, but he succeeds, and he survives the horror. He's now experimenting with plant juices, a pill against the plague, but the doctors swear by the odolus and condemn the drug. Devil work. But even as a student, Nostradamus observed the beneficial effects of plants. To the annoyance of the doctors, he antagonizes Nostradamus, a provocateur. What is the secret of his medicine? Roses are the main ingredient, 400 rose petals picked at sunrise. But can natural medicine defeat this plague? A third of the population fell victim to it in the Middle Ages. In the lab, we want to recreate the plague remedy, exactly according to Nostradamus' recipe. The scientists developed different theories. Was it perhaps mold spores that spread on the wet rose petals and developed an antibiotic effect? And what about the other ingredients? Iris flower dust, woody aloe powder, green cypress sawdust. Surprisingly, little is known today about the effect of such plant extracts. The remedy is mixed together exactly to the gram, as Nostradamus prescribes in his writings, and as he himself probably did it countless times. The ancient mortar is now replaced by sterile high-tech equipment. Middle Ages in the 20th century. Rare shoots of an Indian perennial, the Acorus calamus, are carefully boiled in the still to extract their aromatic oil. Not an everyday job for the laboratory staff, because colmus oil is not easy to produce. Even with today's methods, it takes several kilos of roots to distill just a few drops of the precious liquid. Sweet flag oil. Is the effect of the plague drug based on this golden treasure? In any case, the scientists find evidence in old books that the pungent aroma drives away vermin. The vector of the Black Death is the rat flea. Did calamus oil break the chain of infection by driving away the disease carriers, the fleas? The finished miracle weapon of Nostradamus. Like dough, should the mass be kneaded into pills? All who took it were healed, but the rest died. Nostradamus had written. Institut Pasteur, Paris, Bacterial Disease Research Center, one of the few places in the world where it still exists. The plague. The high-security laboratory is separated from the outside world by numerous vacuum locks. Every plague case that occurs worldwide is registered and investigated here. Since the discovery of antibiotics, the Black Death has lost its terror. Nevertheless, local epidemics flare up again from time to time. Plague research remains relevant. The heart of the department, a P3 laboratory, electronically locked and additionally secured by two vacuum locks. Professor Carniel, head of the department, is preparing for an encounter of a special kind. Lock 3, highest security level. They are kept in Petri dishes in these refrigerated vaults. Different strains of Yersinia pestis, the plague pathogen.
What looks as harmless as fat droplets are actually millions of deadly pathogens.
A single bacterium would trigger pneumonic plague if inhaled.
You can see them clearly under the microscope. Hundreds of a millimeter small rods. The drug of Nostradamus in the test. Can it damage or repel cultures of Yersinia pestis? The scientists can only test the effect in the laboratory. In the test tube, investigations into how the drug would work in the body of a sick person are no longer possible today, and would hardly be medically justifiable. At least the measurement of the bacterial density
in the computer chromatograph
shows a continuous decline in the number of pathogens, antibacterial effect.
With his successful medicine, Nostradamus goes on tour
through the southern French provinces in 1532.
The plague doctors of this period are hired by the cities and paid according to their success. This is how they travel after the plague, straight to the centers of horror. Carcassonne, Toulouse, Bordeaux, Ceylon, Malmort, and somewhere here, Nostradamus receives the message
of one of the most famous scientists of his time, Julius Scaliger.
Scaliger has heard about his successes
and invites him to his hometown of Agence.
He will work and research with him in this house on Plaza Esquirol.
Alchemical experiments. There are rumors of banned scientific circles about secrets that have been handed down and are kept here like treasures, hidden from the prying eyes of the Inquisition. Nostradamus and Scaliger worked together for 3 years, and the wise old man will give away all his knowledge. Every evening, the path leads up to the roof of the house, via the stone spiral staircase, to where they search together for the messages of heaven, reaching for the stars. Nostradamus is at the peak of his career, and he's getting married. The fresh morning of love has dawned for him, he will say later. His wife, a wealthy patrician from the city's best circles. She will give him to children. A perfect love story, a happy family. But then a catastrophe breaks out, against which even the famous Nostradamus is powerless.
The plague is raging through Agence.
Entire streets are deserted within a few weeks. Nostradamus can save himself, but not the lives of his wife and children. How quickly the tide turns. Suddenly things go downhill for him and his luck. The relatives of the dead reclaim the High One with poison. There are even rumors of intent.
Is the quack in league with dark forces?
And the Holy Inquisition is hot on his heels. Fear of torture, of cruel punishments, of the nightmare of dying as a heretic and sorcerer in the catacombs of the church. No one will protect him now. Nostradamus embarks on a journey. He flees for 6 years through southern France to Italy,
then on to Sicily, maybe even to Egypt. Mysteries surround these 6 years. Did Nostradamus see the pyramids? And did he decipher the ancient Egyptians' hieroglyphs, which were mysterious at the time? In fact, during this period Nostradamus is writing a work dealing with the translation of the hieroglyphs, the Book of Horus Apollo, son of Osiris, king of Egypt. That's what he calls his work. This handwritten book survives to this day. National Library, Paris. Behind these walls, the original writing of Nostradamus is kept as safe as a crown jewel. The National Library houses millions of books from all periods, including thousands of bibliophile treasures. Nostradamus' Horus Apollo is considered a particularly valuable treasure, even if the little book just wrapped in plain wrapping paper. It's a typeface that only exists once in the world, and above all, it is the only work that shows the handwriting of the prophet. The manuscript is more interesting than the content of the book, which turns out to be a translation of an ancient script, set in verse from ancient Greek Druidic sources. As he writes himself, what does handwriting say about a person? You can read a lot about your inner life from this handwriting. You can see that the author has not pretended, and that he believes in what he says. That must have been a very lovable person, a communicative person. And then you can clearly see that he always writes from top to bottom, top down, from heaven to earth. This proves him to be a Christian-oriented, medieval man, quite unmaterialistic in attitude, and firmly rooted in the Christian faith. A Christian man, that's for sure. This historical document shows how good Nostradamus was to the church. The story of a criminal case in which the church used the prophet's abilities. Thieves had stolen the silver candlesticks from the Church of Orange, a costly loss. But the bishop has a brilliant idea. Nostradamus should show the way to the thieves. With his power of vision, he asks in an official letter. Nostradamus responds with an obscure horoscope. No one can interpret these signs with certainty to this day. But what the prophet then writes is solid. He asks the bishop to read his letter publicly in the congregation. He sees, he writes, that a terrible plague will come to the city of Orange. If the church property is not returned, the thieves would die a horrible death. Real prophecy, or just some clever psychological trick? Nostradamus apparently worked with all tricks, and the church thanked him for it. The famous prophet and the church, a contradictory relationship. He frequents the papal palace in Avignon, the Catholic center of power in Provence. This is where he maintains his relationships, especially with a high-ranking bishop. During these encounters, Nostradamus must have also visited the St. John's Chapel. He sees the richness of the pictures from the fourth Gospel, and he reads the first sentences of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He knows that centuries ago the Church of Southern France brutally hunted down a particular group of John representatives, the Cathars, a Christian sect that takes the Apostles' tradition literally, that preaches austere asceticism and simplicity, and is therefore a thorn in the side of the powerful church leaders. Even if Nostradamus tries to have a good relationship with the church, the rumors never stop that he too is a secret heretic. Meetings are to be held in the town church of Ceylon. Meetings of conspirators where Catholic dogmas are challenged. The riches of the church, the sacraments, the Old Testament, even the altars and the cross. Even today, researchers suspect that the heretical tradition of the Cathars was cultivated here, and that their secret leader was called Nostradamus. Ceylon de Provence, the city where Nostradamus spent the second half of his life. A small medieval town far from the metropolis of Paris. A city that offers secluded security. A few steps away from the town church, the home of the prophet. Today a small museum. It could have been like this in 1550. Nostradamus sits at his desk surrounded by books. A brooder, a loner who seeks the protection of the small town, perhaps a secret opponent of the church. This handwritten Bible from the 12th century still exists today. The Cathar Bible, a translation of the New Testament into Romansh, the language understood by the common people. Montsaga, a good 300 kilometers from Ceylon, was the center of the movement. Nostradamus must have passed here on his travels, through southern France, but he too only saw ruins from the former Cathar castle. Because the Catholic attackers were already victorious in the middle of the 13th century and left no stone unturned, thousands of Cathars were slaughtered in blood. To this day, the rumor that courageous men continued the tradition has been kept secret. Men like Nostradamus maybe. Evidence of this can be found near the town church of Ceylon, in the cellars of the vicarage. Secret passages connect the church building with the city's residential buildings. Ancient secret paths, through which the initiates could have gotten to the forbidden meetings unnoticed, but the truth remains in the dark. The remains of the corridors were filled in long ago, after an earthquake at the beginning of this century caused the catacombs to collapse, an earthquake that Nostradamus is said to have predicted. Nostradamus, the prophet of disaster, a dark admonisher in the flowing stream of time. Where the Louvre in Paris now stands, was the palace of the French king in the mid-16th century. Times were turbulent back then. Catholics and Huguenots fight each other to the death. France is weak in foreign policy. The whole of Europe is unstable. Times of crisis. Summer of 1556. Nostradamus enters the royal apartments. The uncertainty of the time promoted his popularity, especially at court. His gaze at the stars is intended to overcome helplessness. Nostradamus meets a woman in the castle who will almost succumb to his influence. Catherine de Medici, French queen, and filled with a deep belief in miracles. Throughout her life, Nostradamus will prophesy an event that will make her the absolute ruler of France. The death of her husband. In a one-on-one duel, he is predicted to be blinded in a golden cage, to die a horrible death. 100 gold thalers, reward for the prophecy that promises death, but also power for the queen. 3 years later, the prophecy will be fulfilled, word for word. The prophesied individual duel, a friendly show fight between the king and the count. The golden cage, the golden armor, in which Henry II competes in the tournament, and the king is blinded by an accident. The splintering spear pierces his eye. After days of agony, the king will die in agony. The king is dead. Riot in the streets of Paris. Find a culprit. Nostradamus' dolls are now burned. It was the prophet who uttered the terrible prophecy. Isn't he to blame too? Anger is released. Nostradamus disgustedly insulted this mob as mortal enemies of all education. From the safe distance of Provence, and under the protection of the Queen. It's just a flash in the pan that's burning. They only fuel his popularity. His popularity as a prophet of disasters. This image has survived to this day. In a computer studio, we have saved all publications of the prophecies in a history program. The graphic representation shows at which times in the past 400 years Nostradamus books were particularly in demand. A first noticeable thing, from 1968 onwards, there was a significant increase in circulation. Since 1980, there's even been a boom. The virtual history program shows the historical context. -180, the Gulf War threatens world peace and the economic interests of the West. A crisis that fuels fears of the end of the world. Ever since the first edition of the prophecies, in the middle of the 16th century, there have been crises that keep increasing circulation. Already in the years around 1566, the date of the prophet's death. In times of stability, the work of Nostradamus tends to be forgotten. It is the dramatic turning points in history that arouse interest in interpreting the future. For example, around 1789, the year of the French Revolution, the uncertainties of the era are reflected in Nostradamus' work, as in a mirror. Another date. There were a lot of Nostradamus books circulating in the 1940s. His prophecies are now being abused. The Frenchman Nostradamus predicted that Greater Germany would be called Siegenwood. Prophecies as propaganda fodder. Interest in the prophecies, a history of crises. What did Nostradamus intend with his ever-current pessimism? He makes such terrible predictions to warn people, to tell them if you don't change, you're going straight to disaster. Into the total catastrophe which, as I also believe, will take place on all levels. And if you don't improve, that's what Nostradamus wants to say. Then it happens. Then the apocalypse will be seen to come. In defiance of all courtly splendor, fears of doom must also have moved Catherine de' Medici. More than 400 years before our time, she was filled with helplessness when she visited Nostradamus in Ceylon in 1564 with his huge entourage. An apocalyptic conflict threatens the unity of the country. She has to endure as Queen of France. Huguenots versus Catholics, mortal enemies. The Paris are half amusement far away from the metropolis. The fine ladies and gentlemen have invaded the Provence city, like locusts, and are demonstrating world culture. An absurd spectacle, a dance of death. French society still faces a cruel ordeal. The fight between Huguenots and Catholics, which finds its terrible finale in the bloody Bartholomew's night. They don't know yet. The future, that's the horror. Nostradamus believes in the end of the world. It is special signs that the prophet is now observing in nature, and that allow him to suspect terrible things. A young animal with 2 heads is brought to him, unbound, sign of the apocalypse. A whole new uneasiness drove him around. His secretary later wrote, at first he wanted to keep the dark foreboding to himself, but in the end he brought everything to light. Nostradamus is now writing in a frenzy, verse after verse, prophecy as ecstasy. World history, a madhouse. And the course of the world is a constant movement. The globe, a dynamo of calamity. And the time. A merciless mechanism that produces disaster after disaster. Up to the grand finale, the final end of the world. He wanted to warn people, Nostradamus had said. His verses allow for all sorts of interpretations. His warnings fit all centuries. Nostradamus makes every generation aware of the dangers of their time. When Nostradamus lay dying in his house in Ceylon in June 1566, he had already become a legend.
and he's a rich man. Nostradamus is the first modern man to turn divination into a profitable business. He also came to terms with the most powerful institution of his time, the Church. Throughout his life, his constant commitment to the Christian God has dispelled suspicions that he is in league with the forces of evil. In his last will, which he dictates to his secretary, he distributes his wealth to his second wife and children, fastidious like an accountant. The last signature of Nostradamus shows how difficult it was for the paralytic prophets to write his name. His remains lie in the church of St. Lawrence-sur-Saône. As good Christians, one buried the prophet of evil. May posterity leave its remains undisturbed. It says on the marble slab, his wish did not come true. Again and again the grave was opened curiously, always in anticipation of mysterious revelations. Finally, the German occupiers in World War II, then American soldiers. They didn't unravel the secret of Nostradamus. The future remains hidden behind his heels.